And so we'll get right to it. First, we have a presentation from Guido van der Werf on GFED. Guido, do you have your slides ready to share?
Sure. Let's see.
I'll leave it to you to introduce yourself. Thanks a lot, Guido.
No, thank you, Nancy, and thanks everyone for organizing. I think I've been doing this work for 20 plus years, and I think we always discuss like, oh, why are those, estimates so different, and let's get together, etc. So I'm really grateful that a few people now have pulled it off. Also grateful that we do this via Zoom. I mean, save a lot of time, especially CO2 emissions. So let's get going. So I'll talk about GFED, Global Fire Emissions Database. It's an effort that's been going on for 25 years almost. Together with Jim Wendersen and Louis Giglio, we started this, and over time, a lot of people helping out. And I haven't mentioned everybody here, but especially the people working on emission factors and inversions are not named here. But it's a big group of people, and we try to keep up to speed. So just a quick introduction. GFED was developed to better understand the role of fire in the Earth system. Initially, we looked at the carbon cycle, but later on there came atmospheric processes, air quality, etc. And let's see. Yep. We basically used an approach by Sadler and Crutzen. So we go, let's see. That works better. So we try to get the burnt area, the fuel loads times multiplied with combustion completeness, so the fuel consumption and then the emission factors. And of course, we rely heavily on MODIS. Fuel loads and combustion completeness, so together the fuel consumption, we have been using a carbon cycle model, and we really try to tune the model to match field measurements. And emission factors, we get lots from the literature, although more recently we've also been working on getting our own measurements, especially in savannas, try to get dynamic spatial and temporal variability. GFED is really a bottom-up effort. We're not constrained by atmospheric observations, so we really try to get the burnt area, the fuel loads, etc. right. It also means that if you don't have the right burnt area, or we don't have the right fuel loads, then we probably don't have the correct emissions. So if you really want to get perfect fire emissions, GFED may not be the one for you, although I think we're getting very close now to getting to being, of course, there's quite a bit of uncertainty, but I'm not sure if we still have a large fire, something we used to have. The time series started in 1997, and we're pushing towards new real-time data availability, and spatial resolution is relatively coarse, and it has to do with the way we try to include small fires, and explain that later. We have a monthly time step initially, but we do some scaling to go to 3 hourly. So just a brief overview. We started in 2004 with GFED 1, and I think most people right now are familiar maybe with GFED 4S, released in 2017, and we're sort of on the brink of releasing GFED 5. Will be either later this year, the burnt area is completed, emissions will be later this year or early next year. And what you see, of course, the time series covered is increasing over time, of course. A few things to keep in mind. GFED 4S was the burnt area based GFED 4S ended in 2016 when MODIS collection 5 switched to MODIS collection 6, and the extension has been done using activiers and FRP, which has some larger uncertainty. For GFED 5, again, we started in 1997, even though MODIS data is not available then, but using ATSR and TRIM FEARS. We want to include that longer time series, especially because 97 and 98 was such extraordinary years with a lot of emissions in Indonesia, but also the Boreal region. If you look at the burnt area, you see a few trends. We started off really with active fire data from ATSR and TRIM FEARS, and we had a few mapped burnt area tiles. And what you see over time is that we get more and more mapped burnt area. So initially we had very little, then we had about 10% of the globe, and then about 90%. And And later on, actually, so what we did is we tried to move away from active fires towards map burnt area. But nowadays we realize, okay, the active fires, they have quite a bit of information, and that's basically in the form of small fires. So that's playing an increasingly large role. If you look at global carbon emissions over time, initially they were relatively high. Also had to do because this is a very short time series with 2 very high fire years. But later on, they were low a little bit and converged around this 2 to 2.5 petagrams of carbon. Nowadays, we achieve at 5, and this is a big change. We actually think that the emissions are quite a bit higher. You also saw that when Finn moved towards the new version, you also had higher emissions. So I think this is something for the future. We have to see whether these high emissions indeed make sense. Okay, that's a bit of history. I'll move towards explaining how we built GFED 5, but I'll also spend some time on GFED 4, because I think a lot of people who've been comparing data have used GFED 4S mostly. So modus burnt area, the workhorse, 20+ years of consistent burnt area mapping by a team of Lewis and Luigi and David, and then forward by Chris. And I think we should never underestimate how valuable this data set is. Consistent global burnt area mapping. I mean, when I started, this was sort of like a dream, and now we have it. Also thanks to the longevity of the modus sensor. What we done is we use this as the basis for GFED 5, but we add small fires based on active fires, scaled to moderate resolution burnt area, and I'll explain it in more detail later on. Because we do this in a statistical way, we don't have the high spatial resolution anymore, but we have relatively coarse resolution, a 1/4 degree. Now, this is for most fires. We also, and this is work led by Joanne Hall and Louis Giglio, for the croplands. That's definitely probably one of the most difficult biomes to map burnt area. There's a different approach. I'll explain a bit more detail later, but this is what we add on for the cropland areas. Let me start a little bit with I'll explain more about this burnt area, and maybe one thing, because not everybody may be familiar with this issue, it's a small fire thing that's pretty big, and maybe in the future when we have higher resolution burnt area, this may not be an issue anymore, but right now it is. And I think this diagram shows the issue. Like here in yellow, we have a mapped burn scar, and normally it's a bit more irregular. And this is 500-meter burnt area, and then the red ones, 1 kilometer active fires, and most of them, in general, are overlapping. And that's what you expect, right? You have mapped burnt area, you have active fires, and they overlap. But Jim Anderson, at some point, and this is a paper from 2012, noticed, well, there are quite a few active fires outside those burn scars. So they do represent burnt area, but they're not mapped. They're probably not very large, otherwise they would be mapped. So of course, the challenge is to say, okay, how much burnt area do they represent? And initially, we used a very statistical framework for that. Fortunately, time has progressed, and there's now quite a bit of information on the actual burnt area from higher resolution sensors. For example, this paper from the European Space Agency funded via CCI project. Here, this is 2016 map. This is MODUS, collection 6, burnt area, the same data set we just discussed, 500-meter spatial resolution. And over here, the Sentinel-2 data, the 20-meter spatial resolution. And if you compare the two, you see there's quite a bit more burnt area mapped. And if you look at the ratio, you get this map, and everything in red basically says, okay, there's more burnt area being mapped by the Sentinel-2 data than by the MODUS data. And I think it's very instructive to look at this difference and then separate the fires into sizes. And that's in this table over here in the bottom right. If you look at the fires, the relatively small fires, the fires smaller than 100 hectares, you see that MODUS maps only a few of them. This is 1 million hectares per year for the year 2016. And then the Sentinel-2 data has much more. If you look at the large fires, there's this very small difference. So this again says, I mean, the MODUS data is very nice, the algorithm is very good. I mean, this difference is not due to the algorithm being not good or so. It's just that with a relatively coarse resolution sensor, you won't be able to capture these small fires. So fortunately, we have this kind of information and also from other data sets, and that has helped us a lot with getting better burnt area estimates from GFED5. I'll walk you through these slides. This is the paper by Yang Chen, was accepted a few weeks ago. The data is available. This is a slide in Africa. And basically here we start again with the mapped modus burnt area from Luis Giglio, then overlap it with active fires, and most of the active fires, of course, overlap with the mapped burnt area, but quite a few, and that's shown over here. Active fires are outside the mapped burnt area. And then, of course, the challenge is okay, how much burnt area do they represent? And now we're in a much better position than a few years ago because we have all these different data sets that have mapped burnt area at different spatial resolutions, often using Landsat or Sentinel-2. And that ratio from active fires to burnt area is based on these various data sets. It varies between, for example, fraction tree cover and land cover type. But at some point, we can say, still in a statistical way, how much burnt area is outside the mapped burnt area. And if you add the two, so the outside and inside, you get this map on the right. So this is what we think is both the mapped burnt area for MODIS and the small fires. And if you look carefully, of course, you see there's much more burnt area, but also interesting, if you look, for example, at this burnt area over here, I mean, MODIS, of course, is binary. It's either unburnt or burnt. So it's 0 or 1 in this case. And over here, you see there's a bit more structure. So also what we see, like with these corrections, that the unburnt patches within a MODIS pixel are corrected for. So this is the GFED5 burnt area data set. Over here you see a map. You're probably familiar with them, of course, because we have so much more burnt area, the colors are a bit more reddish. If you look at the number, we normally talk about 400 million hectares per year being burnt. GFED4S had some small fire information, which boosted it somewhat. But you see with GFED5, which is better constrained, it's a substantial boost. Compared to GFED4S, we have about 66% more burnt area. So this is a big change. If you then look at where the burnt area is, and over here I used 14 different GFED basis regions, and you often see this pattern that, for example, here, Boreal North America, you see much more burnt area in GFED5 early in the season. You see the same thing, Central America, temperate North America, for example, Boreal Asia. Also here in April, suddenly you see this big boost. So those are not the big forest fires. It's too early in the season. It's mostly agricultural burning or other relatively small fires. In general, we see this big increase. For example, Southeast Asia has a huge change, but also some regions, for example, Australia here, bottom right, you see the increase in emissions. So the red line is GFED5. It's not so large. So Australia is a continent where most of the fires are relatively big, so the small fires don't add that much. Okay, so this is for most of the fire types. One thing it's only one slide I wanted to show. This is a paper currently in review, if I'm not mistaken, led again by Joanne Hall and Luis Giglio, where they looked at the croplands. Again, one of the most difficult ones, and the difference with the previous approach is that they didn't start from the MODIS mapped burnt area, but they start basically from scratch for a lot of different regions. You see here the letters. There's basically a mapped burnt area using Landsat Sentinel-2, but also higher resolution data. And then you try to link them to active fires. And that's the way to get this cropland burnt area. And you see a map over here. And I think one of the interesting things with the cropland burnt area, you see here the class that, place that burn 2 times a year if you have 2 harvests or 2 times a year when you get burning. Okay, so that's how we get the burnt area for GFED5. I'll explain in a few words how we convert them to emissions. We basically do that with a carbon cycle model, basically nitrogen efficiency model, where we have solar radiation and satellite-derived FPAR, where we construct net primary production. Of course, that's the way CO2 is taken out of the atmosphere, and you build your biomass, your different pools. biomass at some point dies, you get your surface pools, etc., and you have your carbon cycle. And then, of course, we have all the different pools that can be combusted. So, for example, the leaves, but also the coarse woody debris, etc. And we use that in combination with the fire module, which, of course, has an important data sets, burnt area ones. And then for each grid cell, for each month, we know what fraction of those pools is combusted. And we get our emissions. That model has been used for basically all the GFED versions. We always try to improve it. And I think the big change for GFED 5 is that we no longer run it at a quarter degree, but Dave van Wees has worked hard to get a simplified version of the GFED model running at 500 meter native modus resolution. Over here you see a map, and of course you recognize the patterns, right? In the forest you have a relatively high fuel consumption, also tropical forests, and then more towards the savannas, fuel consumption is lower. We get some of the highest values over here in Indonesia, where you also have the peat burning. What we've done in the model is really tune it as much as we could towards the field measurements. And over here you see two images, one in savanna, one more in boreal forest. And I cannot express again how important those in situ measurements are. Of course, there's a lot of satellite data coming in, for example, on biomass, standing trees, etc. But since most of the combustion products come from the ground or the soil, I mean, we really rely on those in situ measurements. And I think one of the advantages of doing this at 500 meter is that we can much better mimic all those measurements that have been made. And over here you see a graph where we combine the field measurements, or we calibrate the field measurements to the 500 meter model. And you see we have about a bit more than 1,000 measurements, especially in the boreal forest, thanks to the above campaign, but also quite a bit now in savannas. But for example, if you look at croplands, it's still a very low number, only 8 measurements. At least those are the measurements we've compiled so far. Right, and finally, the emission factors. We rely heavily on the compilations, for example, from the group from Bob Jokelsen, also from Andy Andrea, and of course, these are compilations. It's a lot of work, but I cannot express again that, I mean, there's so many entries going into each of those compilations. So I'm grateful for the whole community that it's going out and taking those measurements of the emission factors. This is the list we've been using so far in GFED for different species, and then for the different classes: savanna, boreal forest, temperate forest, deforestation, peatland, and agriculture. I want to spend a few words on the savanna emission factors, because that's one of the regions where we've been trying to make some progress. That's work led by Roland van Nooy, a paper that was recently accepted. So this is really a focus on the savannas. Over here you see a map where we've been making measurements. The blue triangles, those are the places where there's literature data already. And then the red dots, also the orange dots, that's actually where Roland and his team went out to fly a drone into smoke plumes and then measure emission factors, not for all the species that a lot of you guys are able to measure, just for CO, CO2, methane, nitrous oxide, but still a lot of new measurements, a lot of variability. And the cool thing about this is that those guys have been taking so many measurements. Let me go one slide back. Basically what they've been doing is they fly the drone over a plume, and this is building on the work from Martin Wooster, flying this drone over the plume, filling bags and analyzing on the ground. And not just one fire, but they've been analyzing hundreds of fires. And I'm not going to go into detail, but this is for the CO emission factor. A lot of different fires been sampled. And for example, you see here EDS and LDS, that's short for early dry season. You see an example here, and late dry season example here. And there's a big push in the savanna ecology community to have more early season burning, also to lower emissions. And of course, you need to know what the emission factors are. So really piggybacked on those efforts. A lot of variability, not just early dry season, late dry season, but also woodlands versus grassland, high precipitation, low precipitation, etc. And now we have so many measurements that we can build a model based on things like vapor pressure deficit, fraction tree cover, just based on a lot of factors that govern the MCE in this case, and we can get some estimates of the spatial and temporal variability. So instead of using one emission factor for the whole biome, with these kind of efforts, and I think that could also be applied to some of the temperate forest regions, we can get some variability. So the cool thing I think about this approach, we get a lot of measurements, so we start to understand the spatial and temporal variability. It's relatively cheap, right? You don't have to fly an airplane, and you make measurements close to the actual fire, so you can really pinpoint which fire led to which emission factors. Of course, with our approach, we only have a few trace gases we can sample, so that's not so cool. It works in savannas because the plumes are not so convective, so the drone keeps on flying. And of course, we need some prescribed fires. I guess with a plane, you can fly around and see where fire is, and that's not the case with this approach. Anyway, let's combine all of this information. So we start off, and this is for GFED4S. We start off with the burnt area, then we integrate this into this CASA model, which I try to explain with this graph. So we get a monthly carbon emissions. Then with emission factors, we can go to trace gas and aerosol emissions, and then using, for example, the distribution of active fires over the month, and even with some information on, for example, geostationary satellites, we get some information about diurnal cycle, and that's how we end up with the 3-hourly trace gas and aerosol emissions. One thing is important here, in GFED4S, we had for each quarter-degree grid cell, we had a fun value for the burnt area, and we didn't know in which land cover type it was. And that's different for GFED5, because now we still have a quarter-degree grid cell, but now we know the burnt area, whether it's in a grassland or a forest or a peatland or whatever. And of course, we also have the separate estimates for the burnt area in the croplands. The second thing is a little bit different, is we still use this CASA model, but now we have the 500 meter data, and within each grid cell, we know what the fuel consumption would be for the grassland, for the forest, etc. So within the quarter-degree grid cell, we get now basically sub-pixel information on the burnt area and the fuel consumption. And that leads us to better monthly carbon emissions. We now use the 6 aggregated classes. For example, the boreal forest is combined with sparse boreal forest, etc. And these are again the classes where we also have emission factors for. For the savanna and woodland, we use we first go to daily carbon emission, and then we apply the model I just tried to explain, the model from Roland Vernooy, where we know based on machine learning how the spatial and temporal variability leads to variability in those emission factors. And for the other ones, for the forest, for the peatlands, etc., we just go as with GFED4. We have static emission factors, and then we go again with based on geostationary data, we go to the 3-hourly trace gas and aerosol emissions. And keep in mind, I mean, this is this is really a team effort, right? There's a lot of people contributing this, a lot of different papers trying to optimize all those different aspects. I guess one thing, and I'm really grateful that we're going to discuss this, this is a lot based on MODIS, and of course, towards the future with FIRS, we'll probably take a little bit different approach, and we're working now on trying to see for the overlapping periods, how can we mimic these emissions we compute based on MODIS with FIRS data. Quick summary. I think we made a lot of progress, and that's definitely due to a large amount of new burnt area maps on relatively moderate resolution, 20-30 meter. And I guess hopefully in the future we'll get wall-to-wall burnt area at that resolution, which would make this effort, which will probably make for better emissions. Fuel consumption, a lot of new measurements, think of the above campaign, and I think our models can reasonably capture the spatial variability there. It's still partly a statistical approach, so we keep on working on the core spatial resolution. We do have 500 meter emissions. That's the work from Waze explained, but of course they lack small fires. So as soon as you include those small fires, it comes at the cost of the spatial resolution. I think that's just the way it is. It's fine for most applications, but it's something to keep in mind. In GFED 5, we have about 66% more burnt area than in GFED 4S, and about 50% more emissions. The burnt area data is available, and emissions later this year or early next year. I mentioned a few times the spatial resolution, right? It's a quarter degree, but the good thing, I think, we now have subgrid information on the contribution from various vegetation types, and that also helps, of course, because we have emission factors for the different vegetation types, so that should improve the emission estimate somewhat. Finally, spatial temporal variability is available for some emission factors. And let's see. Nancy, do you have another 5 minutes?
You have just about 4 minutes left.
Ooh, I'm gonna make it. I just want to wrap up with some insights and also some concerns about some top-down constraints. And maybe for the people who are not so much familiar with this, just an image to explain those top-down constraints. And this is a very old paper, 2008. And you see it also because atmospheric modeling was still done 4 by 5 degree, which is very coarse. But here's the basic gist, right? If you know your fire CO emissions, I use CO, but you can also use AOD, for example, or aerosols and then constrain it to AOD. You know your emissions, you put it in a chemistry transport model, and what comes out is your modeled CO concentration, where you think should be there. At the same time, often something like CO is measured also from MOPIT or TOPOMI, and if that's different from what you think it is, you can do some optimization, and optimization you get constrained emissions. Now, often we're not so much concerned about CO, or we're not so much interested, so we want to convert them, for example, to CO2, so you get your ratios and then you get your fire carbon emissions. So that's basically the way we can use the atmosphere as a constraint. And I think one really nice example is some work from Ivo van der Velde from a few years ago. The big fires in Australia, 2019, 2020, Black Summer fires. If you have your prior emissions, and here we use GFES, and I should say the color scale is very, I mean, you hardly see anything, but definitely GFES have quite a few emissions over here. So this will be a prior. This is then the TOPOMI data from the satellite, and you try to optimize things by adjusting your emissions so you get your posterior emissions, which is relatively similar to your constraints. And then you know how much you have to adjust your priors. And that's shown over here on the right. For example, GFES, which was used over here, has to be boosted quite a bit. Same for GFED, same actually for everything. Fin, this is still the auto version. I think the newer fin is much higher. It's much more closer to the top-down constraints. So very powerful method, especially because nowadays we have improved satellite data on the atmospheric concentrations. Think about, for example, TOPOMI. But I think it's important to keep in mind, you really need to get the emission factors and your atmospheric chemistry and transport. If you don't have this right, then you probably don't do a decent inversion. Also, for example, if I go back one slide over here, for example, GFED 4S has to be boosted quite a bit. You don't know why, right? Was it that we didn't get the burnt area right? Didn't we get the fuel consumption right, etc.? And the thing I want to go towards is that CO as a top-down constraint is easier than AOD, right? We have a decent understanding of the concentration. The CO emission factors is reasonably well known. And most important, the chemistry of CO is relatively simple. And that's what I want to sort of end with. I think this is from one of the GFES paper from Johannes Kaiser a long time ago in the abstract. They also compared GFES with AOD. And that sort of indicated that the bottom-up emissions had to be boosted a factor 2 to 4. I think 3.4 was in the end factor to reproduce the global distribution of organic matter and black carbon. And that's something that has, kept me thinking for a long time, right? If you look at the CO inversion, then something like GFED 4S, and the same is true probably for GFES and other data sets. it also says that, okay, GFED 4S is somewhat conservative, and hopefully with GFED 5, we remedied that. But then the AOD inversion said GFED 4S is way too low. And this is difficult to reconcile. And I guess with some recent research, maybe shed some light on this. Here's a paper on very structural analysis, looking at all the error models. And I think here, this part is important.
You know,
Basically,
we're going to have to stop there. I'm sorry. To cut
okay,
you
I'm
off.
done also. Yeah.
But thank you so much for that last part on the constraints from atmospheric aspects, because that's a very important part to come with. We did have a question in the chat that you can work on, answer Ed directly, or we can save it for later when we have discussions, because I want to move on to make sure that we have enough time. We have so many great, that was excellent way to start, Guido. Thank you so much.
Welcome. Let's see.
Yep. Next we have Johannes Kaiser. Johannes.
Sorry, Nancy. I think we have 9 more minutes according to the schedule before the next talk is scheduled.
I made a mistake. I apologize. So we have time for questions, and Guido, you can finish up. I really, that was my mistake.
No worries,
I was
no worries.
working with, I thought it was 1450 that we ended at. Okay, well, I already started off wrong, so let's move on. Guido, do you want to finish your thoughts, and maybe we can also move to the question that we have from Ed?
No, I was done basically. The only thing I want to show in the final graph is that with inversions using AOD, I mean, if you get your precipitation wrong, or if you have issues with particle size, etc., that's also an issue to deal with. So basically, messages don't blame all the discrepancy on the bottom-up inventories.
Oh, right, exactly. I really appreciate that last bit that you talked about related to constraints from atmospheric viewpoint, because that's, I think, a big part of where we're moving. Let's answer Ed's question, then I have another question as well. Ed asks, early studies estimated, whoops, now it shifted, sorry, that burn scar mapping in Africa was viable for only about 2 weeks due to vegetation regrowth. Has the Sentinel-2 mapping been able to look at that effect and confirm that that's still the case, or that we understand it well?
Yeah, that of course is an issue. I think with 2 Sentinel-2s in the app, you have a revisit time of 5 days, I think. But if that's the case, then it would even be more burnt area, right? If you miss some of the burnt area because there's regrowth. Yeah, I find it difficult to say. I mean, I've been in the field quite a bit, and you know, fire scars after a few weeks, you still see them. So it will be some of the effect, but it's not going to be that we don't see any burnt area.
Great. Question from Mark. For the AOD as top-down constraint, how reliable is aerosol speciation for identifying smoke versus other aerosol types?
Well, hopefully that's a question that Johannes can answer in the next one. Or that's
yeah, good.
Well, shall I just say a word? It's not in the presentation, but from what I remember, organic matter is dominating the AOD, and I never really saw a proper constraint on black carbon in the satellite products.
Yeah, not for some new studies, but I think that's still very preliminary.
Great, good question. Shoba has a question. To bring GFED product for near real-time applications, are you able to get burned area in real time, or what's your thought on near real time?
Yeah, I guess that's the same for all data sets. With FIRS, the challenge will be to mimic either emissions or burnt area, to go from FIRS actifiers to burnt area, and then calculate emissions, or go directly from FIRS to actifiers. I guess there's a lot of, I think GFED is better in this respect with a lot of geostationary data. But what we've seen so far, and Yang Chen has worked mostly on it, that's if you go towards monthly resolution, etc., you can, and relatively coarse spatial resolution, you can mimic the burnt area data sets we have right now with FEARS. And of course, that's not going to be on a quarter degree going to be exactly the same value. But for regional analysis, and I think for large-scale atmospheric applications, it should be totally fine.
Great. So just to remind people, we're doing questions in the Zoom chat. So be sure to use that resource for asking questions. I do have a question myself, because you know how I'm so very fuels oriented, and your new look at how we quantify burn area is showing much more emissions coming from small fires in some areas in early season. How does that translate? And I can kind of guess how that translates into actually emissions from these types. How much will it include, you know, not improve, but increase what we have for estimates from those times? And my thoughts go to the idea of fuel loading and the fuel type as a big driver of that. So can you comment on that?
Yeah, actually, that I think your question also basically is the reason why we haven't been able to release the emissions yet, because it's maybe let's frame it this way. You know, with the increase of burnt area, we sometimes see that some of the forested regions would burn every year. For example, the border between Russia and Mongolia, and of course, I mean, the forest cannot burn every year. So I guess the small fires is really pushing the burnt area. But whether that's really like forested, like forest fires, or more understory and those kind of things, and it's got to be a mixture. But exactly what mixture, that's difficult. In general, you would say that a small fire burnt area burns less fuel than the large fires.
Right, and then the seasonality pushes that even less.
Yeah,
if you're looking at early in the season. So yeah, that's good. That's interesting. I'll be interested to see how this
and this is
falls out.
something, I mean, to some degree, GFED 5, and that's the same for some other data sets, will be still sort of an in-between solution, right? We know the importance of small fires, but we don't know exactly how they are. And hopefully in the future, like if the burnt area community is able to get multiple moderate resolution, say Landsat 8 or Sentinel-2, then we should be able to, well, then we're even in a better position.
And we have Ed Heyer adding to this question with the higher amount of burn area. We're looking at, and small fires, we're looking at things like pile burns and other things, which are various types of open burning that have not always been included. And of course, we need to treat them all differently because of the conditions under which the combustion's happening. So it gets really into the weeds as we get closer to small fires and events that are we know are important for contributions, but have been really not looked at clearly up till now.
Yeah, and I guess you have to be careful for you know, do some double counting. I mean, Joanne Hall, who did most of the work, I mean, there's also planet data being used. So at some point, indeed, you get into like relatively, I mean, almost a campfire. So yeah.
Okay, well, we're going to move on now, because we very nicely used up 10 minutes, and Jessica has a great comment here, I think, back to Ed. So you can read that, Ed. And